ancestors are English and Irish. I was born in London, UK, just south of the River Thames. And I had a really, really weird childhood. I grew up in an intentional community. It was an interfaith community of about 20 very different people. Is this working fine? Yeah, from very different backgrounds, trying to live together in one big building in the suburbs of London. And when you try and live with that many different people, things can get very messy. But we had one rule to guide us, and that rule was the rule of radical hospitality. And practically, that meant that we always had to keep 2 spare beds made up for anybody who came to the door and needed a place to stay. So when I was growing up, I remember Kosovan refugees coming to stay and Taiwanese summer students, and they quickly became my best playmates. There was also a man called David who was homeless, but he used to come for several months every summer, and he was this amazing sketch artist who taught me to draw sitting underneath an apple tree. And however sort of strange that childhood was, I'm also really grateful for it. And I'm really grateful for the teaching of radical hospitality, not just as a practical idea of keeping beds made up, but also as a way of living in the world, as a value, which can be hard to practice because it requires you as a person to try and be more porous than our neoliberal capitalist society wants us to be. It requires us to be able to share our stories and share our vulnerability and welcome that from others. And so I was delighted when Patricia asked me to talk today about compassionate conversations because they're just such a big part of who I am and what I am most passionate about in the world. When I first began organizing, it was with an organization called the Industrial Areas Foundation. And that is a very archaic name, but it refers to the fact that this organization grew out of the industrial areas of Chicago, the south side of Chicago. In the 1930s, at the time, people's water supply in the neighborhood was getting contaminated from runoff from a meatpacking factory. And so what happened was the Meatpacking Union and the Catholic Church, 2 very, very different organizations, decided to come together and work to get the city to redirect the water supply so everyone could drink clean water. And so this idea of 2 very different institutions coming together to work together created a lot of imagination for what else could be achieved when more organizations are able to do that. The main tool that I was taught when I first began organizing was something called the relational meeting. It sounds really simple, and it kind of is. It's a 30 to 40-minute intentional conversation with someone else. And the purpose of it is to try and figure out if you might be able to have a public relationship with this other person after getting to understand them a bit deeper as a whole person. What do they care about? What are the pressures facing their lives? What do they hope for their kids? Why do they do what they do? It's a bit like that cone of questioning that Montana got people to tattoo on their wrists. So relational meetings are, on the one hand, really simple, and on another hand, they're really, really hard because they are so countercultural. They require you to try and cultivate a level of curiosity and presence that most of us just aren't used to in our busy lives. They require you to try and suspend judgment, really hard for me. And they require you to truly listen without trying to fix another person's problem. And this is really hard, especially as we, are confronted by so many issues that feel so urgent and so scary, and there is so much disinformation out there. But this act of not trying to fix is really foundational. So when I first began organizing, my mentor told me to do nothing else except to have 30 relational meetings a week. I was really skeptical. I thought, this isn't a real job. This is like bullshit. This isn't a job. And then I started trying to do it, and I realized that it was really, really a challenge. And so I began to take it more seriously. And I'm so grateful for that experience because it truly changed my life. And it taught me so much about the power of connecting people to their own personal stories and reminding them, like getting them to speak often for the first time in years why they really do what they do. And I also learned how quickly someone else's story became my own, how quickly someone's issue became something that I really cared about after hearing why it mattered to them personally. Relational meetings are also this amazing tool for helping people's leadership emerge. A few years ago, I was working on a project that wanted to amplify the voices of faith leaders who were in quote-unquote climate emergency mode. So I spent weeks trying to approach different faith leaders, calling them up, telling them, please can you come and use your voice to speak about the climate emergency. And I then not really get reply, or people would just look at me bemused. And I realized that they didn't see themselves as leaders in the climate emergency, and so the framing that I was coming to them with was just falling on flat ears. So I had to return to the practice of relational meetings, of intentional, compassionate conversation, in order to surface leaders who might be willing to speak publicly. The relational meeting was crucial to helping remind people of the stories and the framing that allow them their values to come alive for them. And only once they had done that and they had kind of said that out loud for themselves were they then able to imagine taking on a more public role. So relational meetings, compassionate conversations, they're all well and good, but they're one conversation at a time, and that can be really, really slow. And so how do we scale them? Well, Montana was giving a really amazing example of that, and I want to give another idea, which is scaling them through civil society institutions and to help make them part of an institution's culture. When I talk about institutions, I'm referring to the places where people are already gathering in networks. So I'm referring to labor unions and faith organizations and schools and community groups. So instead of pulling people out of their networks and trying to get them to join the climate movement, taking people out of their webs of belonging and power, we don't want to do that. We want to just equip them to be able to stay where they are in those webs and be better leaders in that position. Of course, this is easier said than done. Decades of neoliberalism have had a really destructive effect on the culture of civil society institutions. And as a result, many of them have become really, really hollowed out, and they're really struggling to rise to meet this moment. And it's really sad because they are literally being deprived of their role, which is to try and hold the political and the business class in check. When you add to this the broader struggle, when you add the fact that the broader struggle has become so individualized and so commodified, and the obsession with individual action mixed with the distortion of the power of the internet has meant that there has never been more organizations supporting you, the individual, to make your voice heard with less effect. It's crazy that we now live in a world where you use the same tactics to complain to WestJet about losing your bags as you do to stop the last of the rainforests from being cut down. There was a time in the evolution of the internet when petitions really played their role, but we've passed that now, and so we need to return to this idea of acting collectively and acting where people are collecting already, which is institutions. Now, the trouble is that many of the institutions that we have are not the institutions that we need them to be. And also we're in a climate emergency, so we don't have time to go around building a ton more institutions. So we have to work with the institutions that we've got and reimagine different possibilities for them and try and help them to shift their cultures accordingly. No big task then. When thinking about the kind of culture shift that we want to see within our civil society institutions, I find thinking about the difference between a service institution and I'm calling it a transformational institution. There's maybe a better word to describe them, but for now we're calling them transformational organizations. I want to just think about the kind of broad differences between the kind of cultures that they have. So very often in a service organization, the culture is reactive. It's trying to just focus on band-aid solutions. It refers to people as clients or donors or supporters. And it tends to work on behalf of people rather than with them. A transformational organization, on the other hand, is much more focused on working upstream. It's proactive. Sorry, I need to put my glasses on. It really understands the importance of working with rather than on behalf of. And it's really focused on all the time on surfacing new leaders inside that institution. It has a culture that is relational, reflective, and action-oriented. And obviously, if it's going to have a culture that is relational, it really has to be able to invest in the practice of compassionate conversation and storytelling. The reason why I've named transformational institutions is because they help people solve the immediate problems, and they also help people understand why the problems are there. So they aren't just static, they're supporting communities adapt, and they're supporting to mitigate. Very often, ENGOs fall under the service kind of organization. And traditionally, that's not where faith groups fell, but more and more they are, and the same with unions, as we really have to try and pull back and get people to shift before it gets too late. I want to tell you the story of one church in Victoria that I think is well on the way to becoming a transformative institution. Oak Bay United, during Lent, which is a time when Christians often give up something or abstain from something, Oak Bay United declared that they were giving up despair. And instead, for the period of Lent, they just practiced compassionate conversations. And after the end of 6 weeks, people overwhelmingly said that they felt way more hopeful, and they had surfaced a bunch more people who were willing to join the climate action team. And now they're busy planning for the fall where they want to, they're talking about hosting workshops where people can build their own low-cost homemade air purifier for when wildfire smoke gets bad, or pollinator garden. And of course, all of these kind of projects, they build community, they build resilience, but they also get people talking about why the problem exists in the first place. Another example is here in Vancouver. For a while, faith leaders have been approaching Sierra Club BC and asking us to help them with fresh inspiration of invitations that they can issue to their congregations to get involved with climate. And so we began this thing called the Mother Tree Project, and we've run 3 cohorts so far of about 15 to 20 leaders each time. And people come together and they receive teachings and tools that help them develop climate and ecological plans for their own congregations. And what's super interesting is that, yes, people are coming up with the kind of ideas that you'd expect, like starting a pollinator garden or starting a climate choir. But also what is emerging is this much, much deeper thinking that's moving beyond just an action here and there, and actually beginning to ask the question of how they can shift their institutional cultures to be in better relationship with the communities and the neighborhoods that they're in, so that their institutions can be better able to be refuges of strength and compassion and bravery and inspiration for when, as climate collapse intensifies. A thing that I really love and I think is really brilliant about the Mother Tree Project is also that participants are invited to think about their community and their neighborhood in as broad a way as possible. So they're also invited to think about the land that they're on, the watershed that they're in, their more than human neighbors, the plants, the animals, the birds, and to think about, as they begin to deepen their human-to-human interactions inside their institutions, how might they as an institution also begin to deepen their relationships with their non-human neighbors. Neoliberalism has degraded all of our relationships, not just the human ones, and so I really think that Increasingly, transformations of the future will help us rebuild and strengthen all of our relationships, human and non-human. And so the Mother Tree Project spent a lot of time outside in the forest. Of course, the project itself was really inspired by the image of the Mother Tree as this kind of connector in the forest that's connected to all this mycelium around it, exchanging nutrients and nourishment and information. These are some of the participants talking through the plans that they've made for their congregations. They said they spent a bunch of time connecting to the water in their neighborhoods. Reuben George, who's a leader with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, he was a big part of the Tsleil-Waututh's fight against the TMX pipeline. He's been inviting the faith leaders out to water ceremonies and to join him in Sweat Lodge, all with helping them to just expand their web of relationships. Okay, so we can think about relational meetings, compassionate conversations as being one-on-one. We can think about them happening through institutions, but what if we can also make them happen across sectors? So there is a civil society alliance in Victoria called Greater Victoria Acting Together. The alliance has about 25 member institutions, and it's a mixture of faith and labour and community groups. And it recently had a really sizable win on transit by getting the City of Victoria to create 24/7 bus lanes in the downtown core. This is just one example of what happens when completely imperfect and often struggling organizations can be in relationship with each other enough that they can put aside their differences and decide to work together. So we heard Catherine Hayhoe say it, but it really just starts with a single conversation, and a single conversation that's rooted in love. Reuben George, who I mentioned, he's a teacher on the Mother Tree Project, he's recently written this brilliant book called It Stops Here, which is about his fight to stop the pipeline. And there's a quote in that book which I just love, and it says that when two people come together and share a love for one another, their two spirits create a new spirit, the spirit of love. And I think that it's in this spirit of love that all kinds of new possibilities emerge. I like to think that a relational meeting can often just look like two people in a coffee shop with their coffee cups. But on another plane, what is happening is that we're actually patching a hole in our collective imagination. And as we keep having these compassionate conversations, as we keep patching those holes, all kinds of fresh ideas and inspiration will be able to get caught and come through. So we can trust this process, and it will make us better people. Thank you.